Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits. I'll give you a tour of WELDON'S Practical Needlework Volume 12, published in 1897, and I have more squares knitted from my breed study of 30 hand-spun yarns. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Ria. It's an article about a museum exhibit in Los Angeles that will be around until mid-April. So if you are in the LA area, you might want to check out this exhibit. It's at the USC Fisher Museum of Art. And if you're not able to see the exhibit in person, then the article I'll link to down below has a lot of great photos. This is an article on the LA Times, and if you aren't able to read it, you can read the curator's notes at the museum and see at least one photo on the museum website, which I will also link to down below. The exhibit is by an Indonesian artist named Mulyana. In the article, it says, quote, "The Indonesian artist, known for knitting and crocheting marine life out of upcycled materials like worn clothing and plastic bags, shapes a new utopia that simultaneously calls viewers to action. His practice is centered on sustainability and community with attention to the fading colors of the world we inhabit." During his first snorkeling venture at the Gili Islands, Mulyana was stunned to see how pollution had made the coral look gray. "It was very scary," he says, end quote. So there are lots of really interesting colorful shapes in the exhibit, but there are also some that show far less color. The final piece in the exhibit is called Satu, and it depicts a whale skeleton surrounded by colorless, dead coral. This tidbit also came to me from Ria. It's an article about a 93-year-old woman in the UK named Margaret Seaman, who knits to raise money for charity. So she does this through a couple of ways, through the knitting groups she's involved with, but also through her personal projects that go on exhibition, and then the funds from displaying the exhibition raise money for charity as well. So one of the things that she does do is to knit highly detailed sculptures of buildings, which are then put on display to raise money. A few years ago, she made a replica of Sandringham House and was working on the installation of it within Sandringham, where the exhibit was going to be. And as she's working away, the Queen came in up beside her and started chatting to her about her work, which is a little startling to her. After that project, she decided that really the only thing left to do would be to knit Buckingham Palace, which she says is her last project because her eyesight is really beginning to fail. So Margaret Seaman's Buckingham Palace was on display in Norwich until earlier this week, but her Sandringham House can still be seen in Birmingham. So you can find out more information from the article that I will link to down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me a while back from Daniel, who recommended a children's book called Leave Me Alone. The book was published in the fall of 2016 and it won numerous awards. It was a 2017 Caldecott Honor Book. It was a New York Times Notable Children's Book, a National Public Radio Best Book of 2016, and a Horn Book Best Book of 2016. So the book description is as follows. An epic tale about one grandmother, a giant sack of yarn, and her ultimate quest to finish her knitting. One day, a grandmother shouts, "Leave me alone," and leaves her tiny home and her very big family to journey to the moon and beyond to find peace and quiet to finish her knitting. Along the way, she encounters ravenous bears, obnoxious goats, and even hordes of aliens. But nothing stops Grandma from accomplishing her goal, knitting sweaters for her many grandchildren to keep them warm and toasty for the coming winter. So you can get a peek inside of the book on Amazon to see what Grandma's challenges were with getting her knitting done that compelled her to go on her adventures. I'll leave that link down in the show notes. This tidbit comes from my YouTube subscription feed. I subscribe to a channel called Laura Kampf. She's a German maker who builds things with wood and metal, something I do not do myself. What I really love about her channel is that she's constantly needing to problem solve, and I enjoy watching her work through that process. She also has a really good sense of humor, and her videos are very well produced. So the problems she has might be something that was unforeseen, or it might be a mistake that she made, and she has to find a way to get around that mistake with the materials that she has or that she can get a hold of, which may or may not match the materials that she was already using. Sort of like realizing you're short on yarn and that the additional yarn you need will be a different dye lot or maybe just a different color. So even though I work with very different tools and materials than Laura does, it's her approach of showing the problems and mistakes and how she works through them that I really relate to. She recently had a video called Dealing with Failure and Why I Like It that really spoke to me. And I'm going to leave that linked down below so you can see that video or any of the other videos on her channel. I think that we can all agree that in the moment we recognize a failure or problem that stops us in our tracks. We don't like it at that particular moment. But what she talks about is how much she learns through the process of solving the problem, and that the whole reason she does what she does is to keep learning. That experience of failure and problem solving builds knowledge that can then be applied in the next project. And the next project is not going to be something that you already did. So she talks about how you can't avoid making mistakes unless you only make one thing over and over again, and that you control every aspect of that process. And that isn't really very interesting, and you're not really going to continue learning in a situation like that. So one of the things that I look for in almost every project I knit is, what can I learn from this? I know from experience that when I'm not learning, I just don't knit as much. I learned to knit in 1986, and the first few years I was learning, and so I was knitting. But after that, while I still liked knitting, I didn't knit consistently because I wasn't learning anything new. It wasn't until I started the Master Hand Knitting program in 2005 that I really understood that I could consistently learn more about knitting with every single project. I haven't stopped learning with just about every single project since then. So I'll leave a link down below to Laura's channel and that video that I was telling you about in particular. If you have tidbits that you'd like to share, the best way to do that is either by private message on Ravelry or by using my email address, which you can find on my channel About page. So when you're looking at a video, you'll see my channel name, Roxanne Richardson, right below the video. Click on that, and that will take you to the channel home page. And from there, you will see the link to the About page. So click on that. And then the About page will provide you with all my contact information. It has my Ravelry name, my P.O. box, and also my email address. So if you want to send me physical mail, you can do that by sending it to my P.O. box. Keep in mind that in general, these are ways to contact me about tidbits or business-related questions. So for example, sometimes I do presentations for knitting guilds around the country via Zoom. And email would be the way to contact me to do something like that. I do not answer project and technique questions via direct message or email. I'm always happy to answer those kinds of questions, but it needs to be done in a discussion thread in my Ravelry group, where others can learn from the question and the answers, and others can offer up their insights as well. So there are a lot of really highly experienced, knowledgeable knitters in my Ravelry group, and they are often quicker to answer questions than I am, particularly if the question is posted on a day when I'm making a video. So I just do not do one-on-one private instruction via email or direct message. So I wanted to bring up one other thing. I try not to bring this up too often, but because I've had a few questions about this lately, I thought now is a good time to do so. There are a few ways to support my channel. One is by watching my videos and allowing the pre-roll ads to play. The thumbs up and the comments create engagement, and that helps my video get recommended to other viewers who might like my content. So the average revenue that's generated by a single view is typically less than a penny. So it's getting thousands of views that generates that ad revenue. But if you want to support me more directly, you can do that through Ko-fi. I always have a link to that in the description of any video. That allows you to send a one-off payment, or you can even do a monthly subscription and starting from like $3 on up. So that's done by PayPal. So if you object to PayPal, or if you just want something that's easier, you can click on the Super Thanks button that's right below any of my videos. It's a little heart with a $sign, or probably your currency symbol if you're in a different country. You can determine the amount you want to send, and you can personalize the message, and that will show up in the public comments of whatever video it is when you are clicking on that Super Thanks button. Last time I talked about how revenue is generated was back in September, or might have been early October, but it was after I hit 100,000 subscribers, and I asked my viewers what questions they had for me, either personally or about YouTube or whatever, and a lot of people had questions about monetization and how that works. So I explained how all of that works and shared how much revenue I generate from the various different sources. So I'll leave a link to that video above, but also down in the show notes. And now back to the knitting content. In December 2022, I purchased a 12-volume set of WELDON'S practical needlework. So these are facsimile copies of the first 12 years WELDON'S published its popular series, starting in 1886. These facsimile copies were published by Piecework magazine in the early 2000s. And each volume represents one full year of monthly issues, with each issue devoted to a particular needle craft. Each week, I've been giving you a tour of one of the volumes. Now, Piecework no longer sells these hard copy facsimile volumes, but they do sell digital copies of the knitting and crocheting issues on their website, and I'll leave a link down in the show notes if you are interested in that. So let's go to the overhead and explore what volume 12 has for us. The issues in this volume were originally published in 1897. So this is the facsimile edition of WELDON'S Practical Needlework Volume 12, which was published in 1897. So there were 12 issues for the whole year, and each issue focused on a particular craft. For crochet, we have 5 different issues devoted to crochet. And then this is the first series, so the first time they've had this, crochet and knitted waistcoats. We've got the 4th series of drawn thread work. We've got 2 series, the 34th and 35th of the knitting series. And just as a reminder, Piecework, Long Thread Media that owns Piecework, you can get digital copies of the knitting and the crochet. I haven't really been showing you the crochet, but you can get those, the digitized version of the knitting issues, from their website, which I'll put in the show notes. So if you see something in this issue that you like, you'll know that it's from the 34th and 35th series. And then once again, we've got some Montmelic embroidery. We've got the 4th series of smocking and the 6th of stocking knitter. So we've got a knitting in 3 places. We've got the waistcoats, the just practical knitter, and then we've got stocking knitter. So this is actually knitted crochet and canvas waistcoats. Numerous designs suitable for waistcoats, sofa rugs, coverlets, etc. And they have a long paragraph or section here that explains about the process of knitting a waistcoat. And I explained this a little bit last week because there was one waistcoat pattern in there. The way that they made waistcoats, so that's something that here in the US we'd call a button-up vest. The way that they made those in the 19th century was you would knit rectangles and take them to the tailor, and the tailor would do the lining and the finishing and the buttonholes and the buttons. They would do all of that kind of thing. And what they're suggesting for canvas waistcoats is that you can use these yarns that you would normally use for knitting or crocheting. You can use those to do embroidery work. As a rule, gentlemen greatly prefer dull, subdued tints for such vests as these, relieved by carefully arranged touches of brighter color. For example, a pretty waistcoat may be made of navy blue wool mixed with gold silk, or of ruddy brown with a paler shade of the same color. Navy blue and, I don't know what frosé is, a chestnut brown and gold, or pale blue, dark crimson, and infinitesimal spots of white, gray, blue, and black are also favorite combinations. While the good effect of mixing the two shades of one color must on no account be overlooked, a crochet or knitted background worked with dark wool over which is placed an interlacing or a lattice-like design in silk of a paler shade of the same color is always admirable. And there are infinite ways of doing it. So then they show you an example of the rib and dot pattern knitting. I mentioned last week that someone had commented on not seeing very many vest pattern or very many shawl patterns. And I went back and I looked, and in the earlier editions, they would have instructions for like a triangular shawl, but they wouldn't show the shawl. What they would do is show the stitch pattern, because that's the detail that you'd need to know. And with a waistcoat, you're just making a big old rectangle out of this stitch pattern. So that's what you want to see. And that would be up to the tailor to fit it to the gentleman's physique. They do have an example here, though, showing how a waistcoat would be bound with braid and made up. And so then there's these openings for pockets that would be lined and bound, and then the tailor would make buttonholes and buttons and use buttonhole thread to finish those off. So what you actually see here are a bunch of different stitch patterns that would work well for waistcoats. So pattern for a white waistcoat, a striped design. We've got a check design, a fancy tricote or tricoteur, I don't know how they're pronouncing that, bird's eye pattern knitting, basket tricoteur or tricote in 2 colors. So here is canvas. So it's like that canvas that you'd use for needlepoint type of thing. So I guess that's what they're doing with the canvas, is they're filling it all in with embroidery floss in order to create, or wools in order to create the designs. They have several different ones. There's a corduroy pattern for the canvas. And to me, this looks like crochet. So we've got some more things that are done on canvas. I've got a loop stitch, and then how to make pocket holes. So you can make the openings for the pockets, but then the tailor would finish it off, you know, around the edges to make it look nice. And here's something that's been embroidered. All different kinds of stitches. So there's some that are knit, but quite a few are just using other kinds of stitches and fabrics and materials and processes, and then embellishing them in different ways. So here we've got the 34th series of Practical Knitter, How to Knit Useful Garments for Ladies, Gents, and Children. So this always tells you kind of what this issue is aimed at. And there's an infant's hood. We've got a carriage mat or foot warmer. And we've got a jersey for a boy of 5. So they've got kind of those puffy sleeves, which is interesting to me because the 1890s sweater that I knit had these kind of puffier sleeves. It was a drop shoulder sweater with kind of this puff to it, and I thought it was just weird. But here I'm seeing and it was originally intended for a boy of 10 years old. So here is a jersey for a boy of 5 that has kind of those puffy sleeves. I knew the puffy sleeves are very common for women, especially the huge sleeves. So it's interesting to me to see that, and that gives me a little more context for the sweater that I knit from this era that was published the same year as this issue of Practical Knitter. I've got a child's undervest. We've got a cycling stocking, a child's wedge pattern vest. So vest, in this sense, this is undershirt. Somebody was also asking me in the comments if there had been any women's underwear, and there's been lots of women's underwear. Anytime you see a long sleeve knitted thing contoured to a woman's body in that has been underwear. So then we've got drawers. This is underwear. Ladies cycling glove, top for ladies stocking. Ladies knitted shoulder cape. So that's not a shawl, but it's a cape. And we've got some interesting silk mittens. Cycling hose. So when they're cycling, they're wearing their knickerbockers, and so the turned over cuff is something that is, you know, going to be decorative and be shown off. And here we have a gentleman's golf jersey. So this is very typical of this era to have items that today we would call a sweater be used for athletic purposes. And then we've got gentlemen's bathing drawers. So a little swimsuit, there's a little button there, a little tie there. Hopefully that's enough to keep the wet wool hang up. And this is a long cuff, I guess, for an arm, like an oversleeve. A necktie for a gentleman, and a sock for wearing inside the boot. So socks tended to be things that were shorter, and they might be, you know, part way up the calf and for a child or a boy or a man. And then this is just like a extra warmth for your foot if you were to wear inside of a boot. So now the next issue, it's again how to knit useful garments for ladies and children this time. So we've got this kind of crossover thing. Again, it's similar to a shawl, but it's really meant just like a chest warmer. So they have different names for these types of accessories, lots of different names. And so here we've got a child's shirt, paddling pants, so a little swimming suit for a child, a ruffle for the neck, a washstand back or splasher. Let's see what that is. Oh, so it's an efficient shield against occasional splashes. So I guess you put it on your washstand and it's underneath your wash bowl, and it keeps catches any splashes, doesn't get on the wood furniture. So we've got ladies cycling tights is what it's called here. That's going to be on the next page, but this is a lace edging that you could put on this washstand back. So here are the ladies cycling tights. One of the things I shared a couple of weeks ago about these women in their 90s who had kind of grown up in the Victorian era, the late 1890s. One of them had talked about cycling, and she had a special dress that, you know, was hiked up to just below her knees while she cycled. So this would be something that you could wear for warmth, and probably additional that would go up all the way up to your waist. Chest protector, so that's just for warmth. Male something strap, I don't know what that is. Mail cart strap. The strap would make an acceptable little gift for the mother of sundry small children who are young enough to run some risk of falling out of the mail cart when taken out for their daily airing. I don't understand like what the mail cart, like of course in the UK they would say post, and here the mail is like the letter carrier brings you the mail. So that's interesting. I wonder what they meant by a mail cart. This is a heelless sleeping sock. So this is a spiral sock that doesn't have a heel turn or anything. You're just wearing it in bed, so it doesn't have to fit great, but it's easier to knit. There's a lady's corset cover. So this is underwear. This is adding an extra layer of warmth. And you've got a bolero petticoat bodice and ladies' knickers. Again, underwear, because knickers is underwear. And then you've got an insertion that you might use And then the last issue, the last knitting related issue is Practical Stocking Knitter. So designs for cycling and golf hosiery with various turnover patterns. We saw these in the previous years as well. So the cycling and golf hosiery was really popular. So what you're seeing are, you know, knit whatever kind of stocking you want, but then you can put this fancy sock topper on top of it. And so there are quite a few designs for sock toppers. And then here's one for a boy's stocking with this turnover here, and another boy's stocking with moonbeam turnover and ribbed leg. Another boy's stocking, and a stocking for a lad of 14. And a gentleman's golf hose, turquoise pattern turnover and plain knit leg. And then we've got just quite a few different stocking top patterns that we have on the next few pages. And a gentleman's shooting stocking. So I guess they wore knickerbockers when they were shooting as well. Maybe for every kind of athletic event, they wore shorter pants. Gentleman's stocking in Rob Roy tartan. There's a golf stocking with XO or OX turnover. And then the last is a cycling stocking with a plaid turnover and ribbed and banded leg. So that is it for the 12 volumes of Weldon's Practical Needlework, focusing on the knitting. This was the final volume in my 12-volume facsimile set. Now, I have lots of vintage and antique books in my collection. A lot of them are right behind me. They're from the 19th century and the 20th century. So some of the 19th century books are physical, while others are digital. So if you'd like to see more from my collection, please let me know down in the comments below. And if there's a particular era or type of knitted item that you would like to see featured in future videos, let me know that as well. So about a year ago, I finished spinning a sampler of 30 wool breeds. There was 1 ounce of comb top from each breed. And for most of them, I spun them right from the top using my default method of spinning, adjusting it if I had trouble spinning using that default method. And then for just a few of them, I ran the top through my drum carder and to give it a woolen preparation, and then attempted to spin that fiber using a long draw method, which creates a woolen spun yarn. So most of the yarns are 2-ply yarns, but there were a few that I chain plied to make a 3-ply yarn. So I'm now knitting my way through the hand spun yarns in order to create a lap blanket from those 30 samples. So let's go back to the overhead, and I'll show you what I got done earlier this week. This is the layout plan that I did for my 30 wool breeds. So I had 5 long wools that I showed you last week that I wanted to put on the bottom row, and then the other 25 yarns are going to be non-long wools. To some extent, the Icelandic is certainly long, but these behaved very differently than other sorts of yarn. And then I wanted to distribute the colored yarns. So these are brown yarns, these are gray, and then these two, this is a very light gray, and this is very close to a natural. It is kind of just a natural creamy, but it has a little bit different tone, so I kind of separated it out. So that's the plan. So what I'm doing is I'm knitting 5 at a time and keeping track of rewinding the leftovers into, you know, a little mini skein, and keeping the tag, the original tag, with the swatch and the leftovers. I haven't done it yet with this one, but then I'm reattaching the tag to the leftover yarn, and then sewing the 5 together, just keeping track of the 5. And so I've sewn the first 5 together here. So we've got the Lincoln, we've got the Devon, which is the coarsest, hairiest one. Then we've got Teeswater, This one is Massam, and then this is the Wensleydale. So these are all long wools. Now, somebody in the comments mentioned, I was asking people if they had knit with long wools before, what did they use long wools for? And I thought, well, maybe they're good for like the warp threads for weaving. And somebody had mentioned that they had knit a whole sweater with the Wensleydale. And other people mentioned that some of these long wools were very good for making thread. And I thought, oh, that's a really good point, because flax, which is used to make linen fabric, has incredibly long staple length, and silk is the same way, very, very long. It's like it's considered a filament fiber, and those make excellent threads as well. So I thought that was a good point, that for a wool thread, a long wool would be a good solution. So the next row that I wanted to work on was this one. And so I'm starting to work with the colored wools, and then for the natural creamy colored ones, I'm starting with the darkest down here, and then I'll work my way up. Like the Polworth is nearly white. It's a very, very light colored natural. This is the Icelandic, and here are the leftovers of that. I am kind of keeping track of my leftovers to see how much I have left. Because I am making each of these squares 6 inches wide, each row, regardless of how thin or thick the yarn is and how many stitches I'm using, the amount of yarn that's needed for one row is about 18 inches, so 3 times the width of this. But the number of rows that I will need will also vary. So the things that are at a larger gauge, I'm going to need fewer stitches, but again, fewer stitches and more stitches doesn't make a difference in how much yarn is needed for a row. But larger stitches are going to be taller, and therefore I need fewer of them. So to make a 6-inch square, I need fewer yards of the thick yarn, but I'm using more by weight because the yarn is thicker. That means there's more dimensionality to 3-dimensionality, so it's going to be a thicker yarn. You know, I know I'm going to use more yarn when I am using a thinner yarn, but I also know that I have a lot more yarn. So I wanted to start with the yarn that were thickest to make sure that I could turn those into the largest size square, and then I knew everything else would work from there. So the next one is Eider. This is the yellowest of the skeins. I think another name for this breed is like a German mutton. It might be 3 words, but there's the word German and the word mutton is in the name. You know, when you look at the Icelandic wool, it was much easier to knit with than the long wools, but it technically is a long wool as well. It has this second coat to it, though, that makes it a little bouncier. So if I pull on this, there is a little bit of give to it, and so that one was a lot easier to knit with than the long wools. But look at this Eider. Look how much it stretches. When I pull on this one. It is so bouncy. It has so much elasticity. It was a real pleasure to knit with this one. Next, we have Suffolk. All of the fiber from this sampler was combed top. So it was, processed in a mill, and then it was pin combed, and so the fibers were aligned in parallel. But there were some that I wanted to card to cause the fibers to be disorganized, so that I could then use a different spinning method, the long draw. And so that creates a woolen spun yarn. And so that's what I did with the Suffolk. And this yarn was kind of thick and thin because of that. I mean, you can probably tell a little bit by looking at some of the yarn here that some of it is thicker and thinner. I think I had a note that it was easy to spin. It was easy to spin, but it wasn't terribly even. And yet, when I knit it up, it was fine because woolen spun kind of just expands and fills in the spaces. So, and I think this swatch might have actually grown a little bit. It might be just a little bit slightly bigger than the other ones that were spun differently. So it does have the kind of that, you know, you can kind of have some thick and thin to it, but it's all, there's no holes in it, and there is some texture to it. This has more drape than this does. This just holds itself up more because of it's woolen spun. So let's take a look at how this yarn stretches. So this also has some give to it, some spring to it. The next one was Corriedale, and this is the type of wool that is often recommended to new spinners as being easy to spin. And I don't know, I don't have a note on here. Maybe in my notebook I might have set a note. But the yarn, like this just looks like regular yarn to me. And it knit up, you know, just a finer gauge. It just knit up so nicely. It just, I was really like, oh, I can spin. I'm not a terrible spinner, because if I look at some of the swatches that I made with the Devon yarn, I was like, am I just knitting this poorly, or am I a bad spinner? And I just think that, you know, yarns that have some elasticity to them are just going to be more forgiving. But the Corriedale in particular is really nice. So a Corriedale is a breed that came from New Zealand in the early 1900s. They crossed a Lincoln long wool with merino. So they're looking for characteristics of each of those. And then I think they may have introduced a third breed at some point, because they were trying to get something that can work in the climate conditions and that are going to produce wool that's really nice. But Corriedale, definitely a very nice yarn. I'm very happy with my spinning abilities on this particular yarn. And then the last one is, it's either called Herdwick or Herdwick. I'm assuming it's Herdwick, that's some British place name. It knit up nicely. It looks nice. Beautiful color. Has a lot of Kemp in it. Now the Suffolk had quite a bit of Kemp too. So what do I mean by Kemp? You see these little kind of light colored, this is hair, but it's hair that has a very different texture than the rest of the fleece, and it doesn't take dye. So some of these are dark, some of the Kemp is dark, and some of it is light, but it was just throughout this, and it gives it kind of, you know, a rougher texture. This is just hard, kind of hard on my hands. It was rough, you know, as it was being drawn across my fingers. You know, this would be something that if you wanted to knit with it, it would be something that was very sort of rugged, and certainly not, you know, I wouldn't make a sweater out of it. And you could probably use it for rugs, but it knits up nicely. It's just not pleasant to knit with. But once I sew them together, I have this order, and I can refer back to the sheet if I'm not sure what's what, because I do want to label these on the back. So I mentioned last week that I want to use my sewing machine because it's got some alphabet in there, and you can do machine embroidery. So this is, when I got my sewing machine a year ago, it was a present I bought myself for my big birthday. The sewing machine is a Janome, I think it's 5300 QDC. So the QDC stands for quilting, decor, and then couture. So it's an all-purpose machine meant for garment sewing and quilting. And so the alphabet is really there to facilitate making labels that you would put on the back of your quilt. I was just finishing up the spinning on my breed study when I got the sewing machine. And so I thought, oh, maybe I could make labels using my sewing machine, but I didn't know how big they would be, and I hadn't really planned yet what the blanket was going to be like, so I wanted to see how large the letters would come out. So I have some muslin that I use for doing mock-ups, and which is very thin, so I just used a double layer of the muslin, and then use the stabilizer. This is a tearaway stabilizer, so I kind of tore it off this, but you know, after you need the stabilizer to help with the sewing, and then after that you can tear this off, and then you won't have the stiffness from the stabilizer behind there. So what I was asking last week was, when people are quilting and they use like labels on the back, what kind of fabric were they using, because I want to embroider. So a lot of people gave me suggestions for like, oh, you can get this special kind of fabric that you can run through your printer and you can print labels, and that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to embroider using the sewing machine. And so I think I did get an answer. I think just regular sort of heavy duty cotton or even quilting cotton would probably work. So that's what I'm going to be doing to create the labels, is just machine embroidering in them, hand sewing them on the back. So one of the things that I am realizing as I am knitting up this yarn and then researching the breeds of wool, particularly if it's something that I really like, is that some of the ones I'm really liking are considered long wools because of the length of the staple. But the yarn behavior is really different than those first 5 long wools that I knit up, which were all very sort of inelastic and had a lot of drape. So like right now I'm working on Romney, which I think is the finest yarn weight of the bunch. It was really easy to spin, and it was really easy to spin to a really fine weight. And so I was looking it up because I've heard a lot about Romney, but I've never knit with it and I didn't really remember anything about it. And apparently it is a long wool. It was very easy to spin. Those first 5 that I turned into swatches were not that easy to spin. It was like they were just so different. They were producing yarn that was so different from anything I'd knit with. So this is one of the things I'm going to probably keep circling back through as I'm knitting these, and I'm learning more about this particular breed or that particular breed and how I spun it or how I plied it, and whatever that combination of things is helping me build more understanding of these different wool breeds, and also whether I'd like to spin them again and what sorts of things I might want to make with those particular wool breeds. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.